Hi, so this is take one of my oral presentation, or part one of my oral presentation for my HST 200 paper. I'm going to do this in parts because it'll just be easier to send, and hopefully it all works. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do in this first part is explain why I chose the topic I did. So I decided to choose the topic of the oral contraceptive and compare it to society in the 50s, which is why my paper is entitled A Sexual Revolution in the 1950s, because I felt like even though it was a very small idea, it was very easy to compare to such a big time frame as an entire decade. I have also recently just finished taking United States since 1945, and it was very interesting to analyze in that class what family life and what that ideal family household was like during the 40s and 50s, and how that started to change, especially as the 60s came around, and right after World War II, more women were working, things began to change, and I found that after tracing it back, that the contraceptive pill actually had a really big part to play in that, so that is why I chose the topic that I did. Okay, so this is a continuation of part two of my oral presentation. I'm still going through my intro, so I still wanted to say that the pill was not available to all women in its early days, although it is free today through most insurances, as many of us know. Women were given the right to choose through this pill when they became pregnant, how many children they had, and that was something that really did impact families as a whole. So this was also a very big step in women's rights, which has been examined throughout history because women's rights has played a big part in history itself. And this also marked a shift in society regarding the way an entire family conducted their everyday lives. So that is also why I felt this was really necessary to take those two ideas and really compare them and show that correlation between the two. So this is part four of my oral presentation, and next I'm just going to talk about life in the 50s and some of the culture behind that, and how it started to become a little bit more romantic and sexual in its nature through television, writing, and TV, as well as music. So I'm actually going to start with the writing portion of culture in the 50s. I had studied, which I did not know this author before I studied him. William Faulkner was actually a literature writer and poet, and he had this belief in the late 40s and 50s that writing should be real. What the older generation had experienced during the war was a harsh reality, and he believed that the new generation coming after them had the same ability to write this reality and take all the stories, take the heartache, take the romance and everything, and turn it into something that others wanted to experience for themselves, generations to come after them. So he definitely encouraged young writers to focus more on the realness behind it and not just on the romance, even though after the war, that is what the new generation saw was a romantic period, a happy period. And so through this, he also believed that young writers were a beacon. They became a new beacon for generations after to call on others, to encourage others in a way of thinking. So this was definitely something that changed following the war. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about movies of the 50s. While you probably noticed, TV wasn't that impacting in the way where I probably explained with the music. It did not have a lot of sexual innuendos. It was not full of the crude movements. Many of the networks, in order to air a show repeatedly every day at a certain time, had to uphold many strict standards, and therefore were not able to show if there were any ideas of shows that had the crude humor or anything like that. But movies were different. Movies, as long as people could get them produced and into the theater, then it didn't need to be repeated. As long as they thought that they could have a quick box office hit, that was all they needed. So in 1953, The Moon is Blue came out to theaters, and even though it had a very scandalous plot for the time, it actually had a lot of box office glory. So the film stars William Holden, David Niven, and Maggie McNamara. I don't know if I doubt anybody in my classes would have seen Tammy, but I bet a lot of my professors would know the movies that are about Tammy, where it's that blonde ditzy girl. So in conclusion, so far I have talked about the contraceptive pill, Margaret Sanger, the culture of the 50s, and while none of these have a direct line to each other, such as in literature and TV, you never see the birth control pill really make a strong appearance. It did make an indirect one. It definitely emphasized that sexual nature of what more and more people had to talk about in order to prevent what they believed was a problem, which was oversized families, poverty, things such as that could have harmed more than it helped. People such as William Faulkner really emphasized that young people be a beacon, and this went in line with not necessarily writing romance, but it definitely pushed young adults to become a little bit more open and have no fear when trying to encourage others to do something. Sam Phillips, as I talked about, was a recording record label owner, and it created Sun Records. And this was different because of his background. It was very different than what he could have been. He still could have stayed middle class, American citizen with no popularity, but he decided to make it big, and he definitely did. He put in a lot of hard work and effort, but believed that anybody of any background could come to his studio and record any music they liked, and through the same hard work and dedication to that belief of open-mindedness could make their music big and their name big as well, and definitely did through Elvis and some of the other famous 50s artists. Television, although did not portray anything too inappropriate that I had the ability to compare my thoughts to, it did help build that background of what the ideal American household looked like in the early 50s, late 40s. Just because of the content that they had to stick to on television in order to premiere every day at a certain time. But movies definitely took a turn in the 50s when they started to portray more of a sexual nature in men and women, although women still are in the movie that I talked about, The Moon is Blue. Although the woman did portray innocent, she still did almost fall victim to the man because he did romance her and was very kind and somewhat sexual towards her. And that was different for what people wanted to talk about or acknowledge could be happening with their children, with their other family members, things like that. So I hope that this has given you some idea of how or what change was coming in that decade, and I hope that you consider how that's changed now.